Hi, I'm Martha Newell Kinsman, Manager of Federal Policy at Ceres, and your moderator for today's live streamed Climate Week 2020 virtual event. Ceres is an event host for Climate Week 2020 and is happy to be hosting today's session, Shifting Attitudes on Climate Change in the Republican Party, a conversation with Bob Inglis. Ceres is a sustainability nonprofit working with some of the largest and most influential investors and companies from around the world on our greatest global sustainability challenges, including the climate crisis, deforestation, water scarcity and pollution, and inequitable workplaces. We hope everyone is continuing to stay safe through the pandemic and as we experience more extreme weather throughout the country. Our hearts go out to everyone that's affected by the deadly and destructive wildfires in the American West and by the hurricanes in the South. What we're seeing in real time is the human and economic toll of a changing and rapidly warming climate. With that, I would like to thank each of you on the line for joining us today. I would also like to thank and welcome Bob Inglis and say how much we appreciate your time and commitment to tackling the climate challenge. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Please note that this session is being recorded. We will be providing all participants with a link to the recording shortly after the session's completion. If you have any questions, please enter them in the chat box that's located on your control panel. We'll do our best to answer as many questions as possible at the end of the session. And please note that there is a potential that due to bandwidth issues, we may experience some technical challenges. Unfortunately, these are out of our control. If it does happen, the discussion will pause for about 30 seconds to allow for bandwidth to readjust. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Bob Inglis, founder of Republic EN and former congressman from South Carolina. Bob, I'm sure most of our participants today are familiar with your story and background, but before we really get into the meat of our discussion, I'd love to give you a few minutes to just introduce yourself and give us some background on Republic EN.
Well, great to be with you, Martha, and thanks for everybody for joining us. It's great to be at Climate Week, even if it's got to be by virtual means. Yes, and it's appropriate to be talking about shifting attitudes because the attitudes are shifting. It's pretty exciting, really. You know, we've lived through what we at republicen.org call the decade of disastrous disputation. It lasted from 2008. But it ended. The good news is it ended in 2018. There are vestiges still of that decade around, but I'm very encouraged about the shifting attitudes. And so, and of course, I'm a reflective of that shift, right? I spent 6 years in Congress disputing climate change, saying it was nonsense. All I knew was Al Gore was for it, and therefore I was against it because I represented a particularly red district in South Carolina. Okay, so I admit that's pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was for 6 years. Then I was out 6 years doing commercial real estate law. Had the opportunity to run for the same seat again in 2004. Went back to Congress with a different affect about climate change, and especially because it started with my son. Urging me to change, continued on in a second step with a trip to Antarctica, then a third step, something of a spiritual awakening on another science committee trip, and the opportunity to really figure out how to love God and love people by addressing the climate challenge. So after getting tossed out of Congress for being insufficiently in line with the Tea Party orthodoxy that developed in 2010, I started on this road of convincing conservatives to get in this conversation and to present free enterprise solutions to climate change. And that's what I've been doing ever since. And now it's republicen.org, a team of about 6 of us facilitating a community of 10,000 folks online. We need a 0 or 2 on the end of that. So if you can help us grow, that would be good. Then we'll be able to present the idea that there's a conservative constituency for action on climate change.
I love that you mentioned the science committee. And I think that your story can give us hope for Republicans in Congress broadly. But I know we still have plenty of members of Congress especially on the GOP side, who don't believe in climate change, or at least don't believe that humans can impact the climate. And I remember I went to a science-based technology hearing back in 2017 when Republicans were in charge. And it was then Chairman Lamar Smith who said alarmist theories on climate science originate with scientists who operate outside of the scientific method. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think that there's anything that can be done or any evidence that can be brought to convince the lawmakers who still say that the science isn't settled, climate science is rife with manipulated data, or that humans just don't have enough of an impact on the climate?
Yeah, I think, Martha, mostly what those folks are suffering from is solution aversion. They don't think they got a solution that fits with their values. And so what we need to show them is a solution that does fit with their values, and that is in their own language. And solution aversion is something we're all subject to. Here's an example. Here's a plan of surgery for that back problem you're having. First, we're going to take your head off. After your head's off, we're going to work on your spine, and we're going to put your head back on. Thanks, doc. I'm feeling a lot better. I don't have a back problem. If that's your solution, I clearly don't have a problem. So when conservatives heard that the UN, with the blue helmets on, was going to come here to the US and get with the EPA and regulate our very breath, if that's your solution, I must not have a problem. And so we at republican.org and other compatriots like Ceres live to show, no, there is a free enterprise answer to this. I mean, Ceres does this best in presenting the business voice that says, yes, just price in the negative effects. And for everybody listening to me, they're probably going to say, English, just go ahead and say internalize the negative externalities. Okay, I can probably say it on this webinar. Some places you got to explain that, and unpack it for people. I once said it to the Greenville News, the largest newspaper in the district that I represented. And the guy stopped me and said, what'd you say? And I said, internalize the negative externalities. He said, I can't write that in this paper, man. I rewrite at the 7th grade level. And I said, reveal the hidden cost. Next day it said in the paper, Engels says we need to reveal the hidden cost from the burning of fossil fuels. That's really all we're talking about, right? If we do that, then we can overcome this solution aversion. And people like my friend Lamar Smith, if he were still in Congress, he's retired now, but he might be then able to enter the conversation, enter the debate. As it is, he was afraid, I think, that it's just a regulatory solution and he's not for regulation. So try pricing on him and see if he can overcome and get a better plan of surgery.
So Ceres and Republican.org, I know Citizens Climate Lobby, a few of these other nonprofit organization groups have talked about putting a price on carbon for years. And it seems, looking at the climate plans that have come out of the House and now out of the Senate, and then looking at Biden's plan, putting a price on carbon just doesn't seem to come up anymore. How do we get that back into the conversation?
Well, we got a great new ally. This is Wednesday, last week, right? With the Business Roundtable. What an exciting thing that they now have joined that list that you're making of Ceres and Citizens Climate Lobby and people like us and the Scannon Center and Alliance for Market Solutions. All these are saying that it makes sense to price in the negative effects of the burning of fossil fuels. And what's really exciting is when Business Roundtable joins, they join all those many members at Ceres saying, just make it in the pricing structure. Don't try to regulate what we do. Just put the price in, and then we'll figure out the rest. And so I think that, in a lot of ways, I do admit, though, Martha, the premise is correct that of your question, that it's hard. I mean, if you're talking about putting on a new tax, a tax, if that word just came out of a conservative's mouth, I mean, it's hard, but it's a special tax. It's paired with a reduction in other taxes or a dividend of the money back to the citizenry, so there's no growth of government. And it's applied at the border so that we get the whole world in on this thing. It's a very special tax. And so I think that in a lot of ways, it does look like a heavy lift and impossible. But as somebody said in the Great Recession, the global financial crisis, isn't it amazing how the impossible went to the inevitable without ever passing through the probable? And I think that's what it's going to be on a carbon tax. It's going to be that thing that looks impossible, that becomes inevitable without ever passing through the probable.
I like that. I think that that's a hopeful read on where we're going to go with the carbon tax. And, you've worked with Ceres for years, and Ceres has always said that we need to put a price on carbon. We're not going to get anywhere until we put a price on carbon. So I think that that may be an area where we could consider possibly low-hanging fruit for bipartisanship, putting some sort of a price on carbon, whatever that looks like. Do you think that there are other areas that may be low-hanging fruit on the climate tree that are ready for bipartisanship? And I want to put this a slightly different way. Do you think that there's anything that the House could pass related to climate that the Senate would actually take up and the president would sign?
Well, yeah, I guess we're all in the between now and November 3rd. I don't think so. Perhaps that bill will come through the Senate, maybe. It's hard between now and November the 3rd. And I'm sure that some people are probably thinking, Inglis, all that optimism you were just given to Martha seems a little bit misplaced. I mean, don't you realize, man, that there's a presidential race on? We got one contender who says it doesn't even exist. Well, what I just urge you to look at is a difference in the time horizon. For Donald Trump, the time horizon, his political time horizon, is just between now and November the 3rd. That's the end of his political life. He has no further races in him. But if you're Kevin McCarthy, my friend, a House Republican leader, he's looking at 2020, but then also 2022, 2024, 2026. If you're a US Senator, you're looking at those subsequent election cycles and you're seeing the demographic trends. You know that conservative young people are just like progressive young people. They want an answer to climate change. And so if you have that longer time horizon, you want to be responsive. You want to lead that constituency. So while I think it's an answer to your question, it's a little bit hard between now and November to see much action. I think we're going to see action after that, and it has to do with that time horizon that House and Senate members have. That's different than the president's time horizon.
No, I think that's a fair answer. And I should have clarified that, not necessarily before the election, because let's be honest, nothing's going to happen before the election. The House just passed their CR, and the oxygen is taken out of the room.
Yeah, it's pretty tough between now and then. And I realize too that for some people on the call, Martha, they may be thinking, okay, Inglis, he's pumping out all this stuff that sounds just like Milton Friedman. He's trying to mirror Milton Friedman, and I am. That's what we do at republicen.org. And if you're a progressive and you're listening to it and it sounds familiar, well, it might be that Al Gore has been for exactly the same thing for about 30 years. And so when you just talked about bipartisanship and bringing the country together, Martha, yeah, I think it's possible, because once we get through this presidential race and that's over, then that push of the demographics toward a solution on climate change, plus the longer time horizon of senators and people who want to be Speaker of the House rather than minority leaders, that's going to affect them. And so I'm certain that we're going to win on climate. I'm certain that we're going to get policy in the United States. The only question is whether we get it soon enough to avoid the worst consequences. That is an open question, though, is whether we get it soon enough.
Yeah. So a few minutes ago, you mentioned young conservatives are, at least on climate, very similar to where young progressives are. Yeah. And I think that we can all see this kind of generational shift that's happening on climate. We have these conservative firebrands like Matt Gaetz, who is a fairly young guy, saying that he didn't come to Congress to fight with a thermometer, and he breaks with Trump, at least on climate change issues, if not very much else. So there is this generational shift happening. But I think that there's also a pretty clear geographical divide where you have Republicans in the states that are hit hardest by obvious effects of climate change, seeming to be more willing to publicly accept that humans are impacting the climate and this anthropogenic impact that we have. And I'm thinking of Republican lawmakers in places like Florida, like Matt Gaetz, Florida, which is having more extreme weather events, flooding, harmful algal blooms. So what do you think that Republicans in states like Florida, or say Garrett Graves in Louisiana, who always talks about how they are losing a football field worth of wetland every hour to coastal erosion, or even Kevin McCarthy in California, which is seeing these devastating wildfires, what do you think that Republicans in those states can do to convince their colleagues to start taking climate change more seriously?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is an educational effort, you know, to help people understand that really we're all being affected by climate change. Yeah, you might not be at the coast, but how about your crops? And are you still, do you think you're going to be growing lentils in Montana, or is that going to go up into Canada because of the weather conditions? Um, so yeah, you know, we focus like a lot of it. We're working with Ceres right now in Florida, um, and we like the Carolinas as a place that you know would fit for our message because of the sea level rise. Um, but then I'm also excited about Utah, for example, in part because of Mitt Romney and his leadership, for sure, but also because of my friend Mike Simpson, who is out to save the salmon, you know, and it's been written about Mike, and I can testify to it because it's happened, just the two of us sitting in his office. He gets emotional talking about salmon. He says they're God's most amazing creatures. And the reality is that the Snake River, which divides Idaho from Washington State, is a place that has a salmon run. And we did a field trip there. And I remember Kathy McMorris Rogers' staffer looking like I looked when the wildlife biologist delivered the news that in 10 years, there may be no salmon run on the Snake River because, among other stresses on the fish, the water is so warm that when they get to the spawning grounds, they're dying eggs in. And when he delivered the news that there may be no salmon run, Kathy McMorris Rogers staffer looked like I look, like somebody hit us with a 2x4 in the gut. What? No salmon run on the Snake River. And so the reason that we are so excited about Utah is exactly what you're talking about there, Martha, is that if people in, say, Missouri or Tennessee or Ohio knew that Utahns are concerned about climate change, it'd be a real head turner. What? Utah is nowhere near the ocean. It's not about sea level rise. It's what's about the salmon. The salmon are affected by climate change. Oh, crops are affected. Oh, the bark beetle. That's why the forests look like the way they do in Montana. So all these things, we need those impacts to be more widely known. If they're known, then people can say, golly, this is everywhere, isn't it? Yeah, it is, sadly.
Yeah. And you mentioned Senator Romney. I also want to give a little shout out to Congressman Curtis, who's been doing a
Oh,
lot
yeah.
on the Natural Resources Committee to push climate change legislation, and has been, pretty vocal about it. He's, I think, in his first term, and he's come out kind of swinging on climate change. So
Oh, yeah, he's really, really an impressive fella, and he's been doing. We've been working with him for a while now. We've got a wonderful Republican, we call him, Nick Huey in Utah, who's been particularly engaged with Congressman Curtis, and it's just it's a neat thing that there's somebody who, like say, becomes a head turner because people wouldn't expect it from somebody from Utah. But in Utah, I think that we are operating on another thing, which is a values consensus that's formed in part by the religious consensus that's more present in Utah. And that's certainly something we can work with, is people realizing their stewardship role as stewards of the creation.
I before I came to Ceres, I think you know this, I was a Hill staffer, and it didn't occur to me in that role just how big a part the faith community plays in moving climate change, especially with conservatives. You know, when you think about religious institutions, a lot of times you think about the evangelicals and, you know, who's going to the conservative vote. But climate change, beyond being just a conservative principle, is also and is truly a faith principle, and making sure that we're taking care of our environment. So go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. This is such a rich vein to operate in, and really, we need people to. We need to have this acknowledgement at the start, though, is most people that operate in the faith frame on climate are sort of theologically liberal, if you will. They have a very permissive view of Scripture, and they're probably political liberals, and so if they step into a conservative congregation, say in the Southeast, they're immediately found out as not an authentic member of that community. And so what we need is more people like Katharine Hayhoe, for example. I'm a huge fan of Katharine's because she's a genuine article. You know, I mean, there's this great scene in Years of Living Dangerously where a guy gets out of his pickup truck, and he closes the door, and David Gelber and Joel Bach get this on film. He closes the door, and then he says, I got to go in here to the church and listen to this gal, Katharine Hayhoe. She's one of us. And that's when you know you got the genuine article. In other words, somebody that believes as they do. And you know, that's the thing. If we can approach people authentically, with people who speak the language as their first language, not as their second language. It's hard to do cross-cultural evangelism, especially when you've got to learn the language. But if you know the language, then you can go into that church and say, listen, I'm like you and I like you. Wow, then that's quite a productive conversation. Of course, a lot of times what people hear is, I don't like you. Well, once you tell me you don't like me, I don't really care to hear much else you've got to say. But if you tell me that you like me, and if you are like me, I can learn a lot from you. And we can have quite a rich conversation. So that's what we need is, you know, and by the way, it doesn't mean that a progressive person or that theological liberal can't go talk to a conservative theologian. It's just that you got to go in authentically and say, I'm not like you, but I respect you, and that's why I'm here. But all the better if you can say, no, I am like you, and I'm here because I do like you, and now let's really talk.
Um, I love that. I love that. And like I said, it didn't occur to me, and I just didn't meet with the faith community when I was a staffer on the Hill. And so learning more about how they're impacting the conversation, I think is a huge part that we're starting to really get into, and that I hope will end up having a really important impact on
Yeah.
where the conversation is going.
Oh, I think it's the one, it's the group, the constituency that could change this. We like to say at republican.org, if you're conservative and you care about climate change, you're among the most important people in the world. But I also say to Christian conservatives, if you're in that category, you are in the most important of the most important, because that would come with such a resonance. It's like the resonance that we're picking up in Utah, is that there's that in that values consensus I was talking about. That's, I think, why John Curtis is able to lead. That's able to lead, and that's why Mitt Romney is able to lead there on climate.
So I want to shift a little bit and think about this upcoming election, the elephant in the room, if you will. And obviously, we don't have a crystal ball, but kind of walk me through what you see happening with climate and clean energy, both under a potential second Trump term and under a Biden administration. And I'm not even going to bring the Senate into this because we are time limited, and I want to make sure that we have time for audience questions. But just what are some big ticket items that you think would change or possibly be impacted just based on who wins the presidency?
Well, let's see. If President Trump is reelected, I think there's a period of adjustment there of that change, that difference in time horizon I was talking about earlier, where you have people like Kevin McCarthy who held, if you can, it's hard to remember before the virus, but the pre-times. But back before coronavirus, Kevin was holding a conference for Republican members. 100 House members attended, and the basic takeaway was Republicans need to change on climate.
Mhm.
And so I think if Trump is reelected, what you'd see is this period of time where it's this gear change, where okay, he didn't have any more elections in him, but the rest of us do. And now we got to figure out how to get around him, or give him something that now he would forget about his base and decide that he doesn't need to tell them the conspiracy theories anymore. Um, I mean, I can't predict how the man Donald Trump would react, but I think we can predict that in the House and the Senate there'll be real pressure to move along on climate, particularly as we continue to get news from the West Antarctic ice shelf changes, and the moving of the land ice into the sea, and the glacier moving more quickly. Wow, I think it's just going to accelerate the time frame in which those longer horizon people will want to act. If Joe Biden gets elected, I just hope that he will listen to Ceres and to our friends at CCL, and our friends at the Climate Leadership Council, and our friends at Alliance for Market Solutions, and us at republicen.org, and make it bipartisan, and find a way to do this through a pricing mechanism first, and then gather enough bipartisan support to make this durable. And if I could just say that, Martha, it's important to just keep that in mind. That needs to be the goal, right? Is bipartisanship here. If you attempt to do climate change just on one side of the aisle, it's really risky, because you end up with a non-durable product. And so we need it to be bipartisan. And for those who are doubtful, thinking, oh, Inglis is a real dreamer, like he's going to get the Republican Party to come along on this. Well, just remember, or just think about this. You don't have to have a thoroughgoing conversion of the Republican Party. I'd like that. I'm a Republican. I want it to be thoroughly with us on climate. But all it takes is like 25 House Republicans, maybe 12 to 15 Senate Republicans joining with Democrats. And then if Joe Biden is president, him signing it. And then we've got durable legislation. To start with, hopefully it's a pricing mechanism. And for those who are out there saying Inglis, that's not going to be enough, pricing ain't going to do enough. Okay, that may be true, particularly in the transportation sector. It might not be a strong enough signal. Talk about higher CAFE standards then, answering further one of your earlier questions, Martha, about what else can we do. And if fugitive emissions of methane aren't going down because of that pricing, okay, well then probably that's ripe for a regulatory solution there then. But so I think that I just hope that Joe Biden, this is not a prediction, it's just a hope so, that Joe Biden will realize the importance of bipartisanship and pull the country together to solve climate change, rather than attempting to run right down the left-hand side of the field, because that's a really risky play.
I would hope that given Joe Biden's history as a senator and then as Obama's vice president, he seems to understand bipartisanship. Of course, when you are the man in charge, it's sometimes a little bit of a different story from what I understand.
Mm-hmm.
But I would agree with you and hope that Biden won't forget that you need Republicans to come on board. And I've heard a lot of people speculate that the Senate may flip, and if it does, then there may be some more room. But even if the Senate flips, I think that a lot of people forget that the filibuster, as of now anyway, is still in place. And so
Yeah.
you need those 60 votes. You're going to need Republicans to come on board.
Yeah, and please, if somebody knows Chuck Schumer, I mean, I knew him when he was in the House. I'm not sure I got a word in edgewise, but if you sorry, Chuck, but if you know Chuck, try to persuade him of this, that even if you get the majority, don't do it just as a Democrat solution, because really we're literally in this together, and we got to make this bipartisan. If you think about it, just how risky the solution is, it's a little bit like, I mean, you got to control the House. If you try to do it on one side, you got to control the House, the Senate, the White House, and the Supreme Court. And you got to get through a bunch of district courts too. Anyway, it's a low percentage shot, a little bit like my mother was a very good golfer, and I'd play with her, and I'd end up in the woods, and she'd say, "Bob, it's a chip shot out to the fairway, and then you're right down the fairway. You're just one shot down." And I'd say, "No, no, Mom, look right through there, right through those two trees. I can go right through there." Whack! I'd hit it, it hit the tree and come right back to where we were. And she said, "Now you're two down, Bob. It's a chip shot out to the fairway." And so, anyway, that's the low percentage shot if you try to run this on one side of the aisle.
Well, I don't know Chuck Schumer, but I have seen how he looks at reporters, and I don't know that anybody can get a word in edgewise.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so hopefully.
I do want to remind our participants to please enter questions in the chat box. We'll be going over to participant questions, audience questions in a few minutes, but Bob, I have a couple more questions for you if that's okay.
Please.
So I'm going to bring up an old quote of yours. You
Oh,
said, "It's a dangerous strategy to build conservatism on information and policies that are not credible." And I think that that's a great quote for today, although you said it in 2011 about the Tea Party. And
yeah.
the Tea Party, of course, still has some sway in the House through the Freedom Caucus, although it seems to kind of be losing steam with every news cycle. Um, and it seems like the GOP has kind of backed away from courting at least that extreme wing to kind of getting back to baseline.
Yeah.
But it's still a quote that really resonates with what is happening in the party today with the president that we have. Um, so do you think that Republican Party can come back from its current state of relying on Trump type politics, or do you think that this is going to end up being a fundamental shift in the party?
Well, the good thing about facts is eventually they overtake shaky ideology. I mean, you can get along for a while on shaky ideology, but eventually the facts overtake you. And of course, when you're being overtaken, it's better to go ahead and give way rather than try to dig in and deny the obvious. Um, but it is a strange moment, isn't it, Martha? In fact, I just happened to have on my desk right here something I just scanned and sent to a friend. It's the Lexington piece in the September 12th issue of the Economist. And gee, Mani, is it a little bit depressing? Here I am trying to be the sunny optimist, but I got to tell you, you don't want to read this, or if you want a balance to my sunny optimism, read this Lexington piece, um, because he goes to Ohio and talks to people that he talked about or talked to, or the same crew that he talked to in 2016, and um, I mean, it's the people he's talking to actually believe that the wall has been built, that the deficit is down, that healthcare has been solved.
Wow.
It's unbelievable. I mean, it's like, and you're thinking, where where did you get that cult message? I guess it's really cult-like, I mean, that's so. You're asking the question. It's a good question. How do you break the spell of a cult? I don't know. I mean, if you read this article, it really does read like cult material. That
I'm going to have an article
you know,
now.
that people are suspending any skepticism about information and are believing sources that are really suspect. And so I'm sure this happens on the left as well. I mean, there's some crazy theories on the left, but I'm more aware of the ones on the right because that's, who my people are and who I have, live and breathe with. And so uh, it's really a tough time to present fact-based information. It's sort of like I got my South Carolina was the recipient of the 3 of the top 10 quotes of the year. One year, one of them was he's hiking the Appalachian Trail. Another was "You lie," sadly, and then a third was at my town hall meeting. A guy stood up and said, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare." And of course, I had to disabuse him of the notion that it was not a government program. But what I'm saying is that the information flow, we're dealing with a situation where people now get their news from news islands that affirm their views, and it becomes cult-like because you're within this bubble of there's a reinforcing, there's a confirmation bias, and so yeah, it's tough for us who are trying to operate, with scientific information. But the good news is, as people experience climate change, I think that's going to be the thing that moves them. Um, it's not the only thing that's going to move them. The thing that's moving best, if I could add that, is just people who care for them, talking to them about it. That's what's going to move them. But they're also going to be moved by seeing it themselves. The water coming up, or the salmon, or the smoke from the wildfires, or the pine beetle. They're seeing it.
I think that you're right. I think that more and more people are seeing the effects of climate change, even if we're not all putting it together as climate change, or seeing that the environment around them is changing. It's different from, I'm 35 and it's different from when I was growing up in Connecticut. I go back home now and the temperatures are different. There's less
Yeah.
snow, it's changed just in my lifetime. Um,
Yeah.
we're going to go to audience questions in just a minute. One more time, please make sure that you're putting your questions in the chat box and we will get to as many as possible. I'm sure some of our participants are represented by members of Congress who either don't believe in climate change at all, or again, more likely just don't believe that humans can change the environment.
Yeah.
So is there anything that your average constituent can do to convince their lawmakers or to talk to their lawmakers about climate?
Yes. It's just that last phrase: talk to your lawmakers about climate. That's it. And it doesn't take much. Go to the $25 barbecue. Or if you got $1,000, go to the $1,000 dinner if we ever get back to having actual barbecues and actual dinners. Um, uh, you don't have to be a well-versed expert. You don't have to have the plan in your pocket that's 18 pages long and you hand it to him or her. Just say, "Sally, Congresswoman, I really want you to act on climate change." Or just say to Joe, the congressman, "Really need you to pay attention to climate change." That's all you got to say. And especially, again, if you're a conservative, if you happen to be a conservative and you're at, say, a Republican fundraiser, that $25 barbecue, Sally and Joe are going to make a mental note that you and several others talk to them about climate at the barbecue. And that's gonna make a difference. That's what's really gonna change things. So yeah, just talk to them. Um, and if you're a progressive, then find some friend that's a conservative, and then you go with them somewhere to the town hall meeting and point to your conservative friend and get them to speak to Joe or Sally.
All right, before we go to audience questions, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our participants?
Plugging in my computer to make sure I don't die here on you. So, um, yeah, I think just this, we're testing out some messages right now in some less than a minute videos, and uh, one of them really talks about love as the angle that's going to work here. It's really what moved me is the love of my son, my daughters, uh, Scott Heron, the Aussie climate scientist who inspired me with loving God and loving people. it's the thing that's going to break through. And so it's all about respecting and loving other people and having that conversation with them about, shouldn't we care and don't we care? And just toning it down a little bit on you're the dumb kid in the class, the last one to get it. We really need to give people the opportunity to move here, and they can move in a milieu of love. Um, they can't move and reposition themselves in an environment that has no grace in it. So we've got to extend grace to people. I mean, and I'm the recipient of that. I mean, I've had a lot of people, especially people that would probably disagree with me on a number of positions that I took in Congress, that have nevertheless let me move from my previous position of disputing climate change to saying, okay, Bob, it's great. Now you're talking about what we can do about climate change. We welcome you to the conversation. So it's about love, and it's about grace, and it's about welcoming people to the conversation.
Perfect final thought. Um, we are going to go over to audience questions. And the first one that we have is, what's the biggest mistake that you see progressives making in the way they talk to conservatives about climate change?
That's such a great question. Yeah. Um, Basically talking about limits and attacking the capitalistic system. That that's really death to the conversation if you're trying to start it with conservatives. Is is talk about abundance, talk about innovation, talk about how we want more energy, more mobility, more freedom. We just want it cleaner, better, faster, and cheaper. And that's going to come through innovations in the free enterprise system. That's what series members know and prove all the time, right? I mean, if I thought it was very interesting early in the pandemic, there's some question about what philanthropy could do. And I was on one of these calls with a lot of philanthropists and others, NGOs. What can we do? And the answer was produce protective gear. And and so it shows that the series members, for example, who do that, who serve customers by meeting their needs, that's to be celebrated, not to be criticized. And so the left, I think, too often comes across as like we need to ditch the capitalistic system. Do really? No, those are the people who are producing the protective equipment for us. Those are the people who can actually deliver the fuels of the future, who can do this. If we just make the free enterprise system accountable for its emissions, then all kinds of good things start happening. So yeah, talk about abundance and don't attack the capitalistic system, because if you do, well, I mean, who else is going to do it? Who's going to deliver the better batteries? Sure, we need government spending, by the way, on R&D, because a private company can't do that in fidelity to its shareholders necessarily. But once it becomes commercially possible, then the free enterprise system, they're the ones that are going to deliver it to us. And so celebrate them, don't attack them.
I have another constituent related question. There's a sense that Republican leaders are afraid of being pro-climate because their constituents are against it. And I'm going to add into this from the series perspective also that the businesses in their district may be against it. Do you think
Yeah.
that grassroots can change the climate denial leaders? Oh, yeah. Do you think the grassroots can change quickly if a few climate denial leaders are no longer spreading that anti-climate message and that the constituents don't believe in it? So I think that this is more, is the silent majority stronger than the loud minority?
Yeah, well, I think that we definitely need to make visible and audible a constituency for action. There's clearly a constituency on the left. If you look in the question about ranking your priorities, well, on the left, climate change ranks pretty highly. If you look on the right, thankfully there's majority support for action on climate on the right, but in salience, it's down on the list. And so that's what I'm talking about showing up at Jim or Sally's barbecue and just saying to them that you care about climate. That creates that visible and audible constituency, and that's all it takes. Doesn't mean you got to have an 18-point plan about how to fix it. Just say you care, and then Jim and Sally will get the memo. And once they feel that they have support, then they'll lead. Because I hope this doesn't come as a shattering surprise to anybody on the call, but politicians typically follow, they don't lead. It's a very rare bird in politics that actually leads. Because when you lead, you might get shot in the back by your own people. But if we can establish a constituency, then you'll find politicians running around out front to lead them where they're going. So that's what we need to do, is make them visible, make them audible, that constituency.
You kind of led into the next question perfectly. According to an NPR PBS poll, 22% of Democratic voters say that climate change is a top campaign priority heading into the election, but 1% of voters say that climate change is the top issue. So how can we address the gap?
Yeah, I think it is mostly about undoing this cultural marking that's happened. I mean, it's deep. It happened in that decade of disastrous disputation. As I said earlier, there's still some vestiges of that, and we're still working to overcome it. But yeah, it got culturally marked. If you think about it, it's hard to remember this, but in early '08, Newt Gingrich was on the couch with Nancy Pelosi. We don't agree on much, do we, Newt? No, Nancy, but we agree climate change is real. We need to do something about it. That was early '08. By the end of '08, Newt had switched. We don't know, he said. Intervening events were two. One, the commencement of the global financial crisis and the Great Recession, and the election of a secret Muslim non-American socialist to the White House. Well, he's none of those things. Sadly, my party called him those names. We were fine to disagree with him, but we didn't need to call him names. But that began the decade. And then it lasted until 18, when Republicans lost control of the House. And the realization dawned on Kevin McCarthy and others that you can't win the majority back without winning suburban districts. And you can't win suburban districts with a retro position on climate change. And so that's what we're still dealing with, the vestiges of that terrible decade of disputation. We lost such valuable time during that decade, because the longer you wait, the harder it is to solve climate change and the more expensive it is. And so, yeah, the salience that you just cited, those numbers, I think are correct. We've got to move it up in salience on the right. And that comes by overcoming solution aversion. It comes by credible messengers. And it comes by going on the ground and talking to people and making them audible so that congressional representatives can hear them.
So let's think about the talking heads on Fox News, got Rush Limbaugh on the radio, OAN.
Do we have to?
Well, we don't have to think about them hard.
Okay.
How do we overcome the misinformation that they're spreading and rebuild working relationships with conservative leaders?
It's so pernicious, isn't it? It's like the reason all I can think of an answer to your question, Martha, is being on a talk radio show in Ithaca, New York one time, and the guy was actually with us. It was a very rare situation. He's a Rush Limbaugh show. In other words, a radio station that runs Rush Limbaugh, and this talk radio guy, I got him. Well, I shouldn't use his name because I'm about to say something about him that's wonderful, but he might get in trouble as an industry. But he's with us. And he gave me some advice. He said, you want to know how you get to the average talk radio host in a local station? Advertise. He said, they will change their editorial point of view if you get them to read your ads. And so he said, he gave me an example. We had the opposite treatment in Wisconsin by a talk radio host she was on the air calling our volunteers socialist and communist.
Huh.
And this guy in Ithaca, New York told me, he said she doesn't believe that. She's an entertainer, just like Rush Limbaugh, a total entertainer. They don't believe what they're saying, but it's also about it's about revenue. And so he said, here's how you switch her in Wisconsin. Just put some money on her station and have her do the read of your ad. She'll switch because You're paying the bill. Okay, so that's rather cynical, wasn't it? We didn't do it. We don't have the budget to do it, unfortunately, but I sure would like to test that. Anybody listening that wants to give us some money to test that, we could test it. We could see whether you could flip a local talk host into a pro climate position just by having them read the ads.
So I have, I think we've got time for about 2 more questions. One just came in that I think is going to be very easy for you. Given the time urgency to act on climate, would Bob endorse that Republicans vote for Joe Biden?
Well, I've joined Republicans for Biden, so yeah, that's I guess I'm on your radio, so I can say it. If I was on RepublicIan.org radio, I couldn't say it because that's a 501. We're a 501c3. But yes, I've joined Republicans for Biden, and so we're uh, and I think for a number of reasons that are in addition to climate, that I think that Joe is the better choice.
And I think we have time for one, maybe 2 more. This is a question from somebody in Chico, California, just a few miles from the Camp Fire in 2018, and pretty close to one of the wildfires that's happening now. There are congressional representatives who are lockstep with Trump's views, who represent them, Republicans who are lockstep on climate change with Trump. How do we reconcile the fact that Trump was just in California a week ago saying that climate change is not to blame for the devastation that Californians are going through? And how do we communicate with our representative on the facts of climate change versus Trump's manufactured reality?
Yeah, it's so tough. That manufactured reality, that's a good way to describe it, right? That's the cult belief that I was talking about in this Lexington article about how they actually believe that the that the deficit is down. That's what one of these folks tells Lexington. No, the deficit is up. Um, and so, and of course, what a good cult leader does is they mix a little bit of truth in with the falsehood, right? And so the little bit of truth is, yeah, management of the forest in California would help us. And so when Trump talks about cleaning the forest floor, there's a little bit of truth to that, And so what you got to do is I think you can back to that approaching with love and grace is you can say to that person that's having a hard time breaking out of the cult's bubble is say to them, there is some truth to that management thing. We do need to do a better job of managing the forest. But doesn't it make sense to you that it's also drier because of climate change? And doesn't that mean that we've got a greater risk? And yes, we need to address where we site houses. That's another thing. And yes, as a conservative, you could say that probably some of the problems in California with the commutes and everything have to do with the lack of buildup of multifamily housing at BART stops, for example. That has something to do with it. Yes, all those things are there, but don't let the cult leader then take you away to a place where you're not focusing on the really big thing, which is climate change is driving this, and it should be an alarm bell going off for us that pay attention to this, and let's. The example I use is I've just been to the dermatologist. You can probably tell I've got a number of things frozen off earlier. So if you go quickly enough, they can handle it, and it's really not a big deal. But if you wait and wait and watch that thing grow, if it turns out to be melanoma, it can be really a deadly cancer. Go early. You could go get it taken care of, and that's what we need to do in climate change.
I think that is a perfect place to leave off. We are just about out of time. So Bob, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our participants for taking part in today's session. As a reminder, you'll receive a follow-up email with the recording of the session shortly. And please note that our next session will be later today, starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on investor expectations in 2021, setting a course for effective climate lobbying. If you're interested in attending or would like more information on other events that Ceres will be hosting or participating in throughout Climate Week, please go to www.ceres.org/climateweek2020. Thank you all so much for your participation. Bob, once again, thank you for your time, and this session is adjourned.
Thanks, Bertha. See ya.